This is completely unacceptable. You call this craftsmanship? You've set us back weeks with your incompetence, old man.
Something happened on that construction site. Something small enough to ignore, but powerful enough to change a man's entire life. It started with a single brick, a raised voice, and a moment of disrespect he thought meant nothing. But that moment didn't stay buried, and it followed him all the way into the foundation of the building he was so proud of. Stay with this story till the end. You'll see why one careless decision almost cost him the one thing money can't rebuild. The morning sun barely cut through the dust cloud that hung over the construction site like a dirty veil. Steel beams rose against the sky, scaffolding climbed higher each day, and the sound of machinery competed with shouting voices and the constant percussion of hammers against metal. Concrete trucks idled near the entrance, while workers in hard hats moved with practiced urgency, carrying materials, checking blueprints, securing chains around bundles of rebar. The air smelled of diesel fuel and fresh mortar, and everything vibrated with the rhythm of progress. A luxury sedan pulled up to the site entrance, sleek and black against the gray chaos of construction. The door opened and a man stepped out, his tailored suit somehow staying crisp despite the heat and dust. He moved through the site with the confidence of ownership, his eyes scanning every corner, every unfinished wall, every worker's movement. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense. There were deadlines to meet, investors to satisfy, a reputation to maintain. Every delay cost money. Every mistake cost more. He stopped near the eastern wing where a section of wall was taking shape. Most of the workers here moved quickly, slapping mortar, placing bricks with practiced speed, keeping rhythm with each other like parts of a well-oiled machine. But one man worked differently. He was older, his hair mostly gray, his movement deliberate and slow. He held each brick before placing it, turning it slightly, studying its face, running his weathered fingers along the edges. Then, with careful precision, he would set it into the mortar bed, adjusting it minutely, checking the level, tapping it gently with his trowel. It took him 3 times longer than the younger workers to place a single brick. The other workers noticed him but didn't comment. They had learned to work around his pace. During breaks, they spoke about him in low voices, words mixing with the sound of water bottles being opened and boots scraping against gravel. One worker mentioned how the old man's walls never needed correction, how inspectors always praised his sections, how his lines stayed true even as the building settled. Another said he'd been doing this since before any of them were born, back when everything was done by hand and eye, before laser levels and computer measurements. Someone else added quietly that something had happened to his hands years ago, but nobody seemed to know exactly what. The details were lost in time, buried under decades of mortar dust and half-remembered stories. The man in the suit watched the bricklayer work for several minutes, his impatience building with each slow, methodical movement. His phone buzzed constantly in his pocket. Emails about delays, messages about budget concerns, reminders of meetings he was already late for. And here was this old man, treating each brick like it was made of glass, like time itself didn't matter, not like the whole world could wait while he decided if a corner was aligned perfectly enough. Finally, he walked closer, his expensive shoes leaving prints in the scattered sand. His voice came out sharper than he intended, cutting through the construction noise. The old man paused, brick in hand, and looked up slowly. His eyes were calm, patient, showing no reaction to the frustration in the younger man's voice. The words hung in the air between them. Something about speed, about schedules, about whether he was building a house or counting his breaths. A few nearby workers glanced over, then quickly looked away, focusing intently on their own tasks. The bricklayer said nothing. He simply lowered his gaze back to the brick in his hands, turned it once more, and placed it with the same careful precision as before. His fingers lingered on the surface for a moment, almost reverent, as if the brick itself was something worth respecting. Then he reached for his trowel, smoothed more mortar, and prepared for the next one. The man in the suit shook his head and walked away, muttering about efficiency and modern standards. Behind him, work continued at its varied pace. The younger workers moved quickly, keeping up with deadlines. The old bricklayer moved slowly, keeping up with something else entirely, something that couldn't be measured in schedules or profit margins. As the day wore on, the heat intensified. The sun climbed higher, turning the site into an oven of concrete and steel. Workers took frequent water breaks, wiping sweat from their faces, seeking whatever shade they could find. The old bricklayer took fewer breaks, but when he did, he sat alone, looking at the walls he'd built, studying them from different angles, nodding slightly as if confirming something only he could see. During lunch, small groups formed in the shade of the unfinished structure. Sandwiches were unwrapped, thermoses opened, and conversation flowed more freely. One worker defended the old man without being asked, explaining to a newer hire that speed wasn't everything, that some things couldn't be rushed. Another added that he'd once seen the old bricklayer refuse to use a cracked brick, even though it would have been hidden inside the wall where nobody would ever see it. The newer worker asked why that mattered, and the others just shrugged, unable to fully explain the principle but understanding it instinctively. The afternoon brought more tension. The man in the suit made several more rounds, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing as he argued with someone about timelines. He checked various sections of the building, approved some work, demanded corrections on others. Each time he passed the eastern wing, he glanced at the old bricklayer's progress with visible irritation. The wall was growing, but slowly, brick by careful brick. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the construction site, workers started cleaning their tools, securing equipment, preparing for the end of the shift. The sound of machinery gradually quieted, replaced by the scrape of shovels, the splash of water, cleaning trowels, the metallic click of toolboxes closing. The old bricklayer finished his last brick of the day, stood back to examine his work, then nodded to himself and began gathering his tools. He walked slowly across the site toward the temporary office where the man in the suit was reviewing paperwork with the site supervisor. His boots were covered in dried mortar, his clothes stained with the evidence of decades of work. He carried a small envelope, worn at the edges, and waited patiently outside the office door until there was a pause in the conversation. When he entered, he simply placed the envelope on the desk. It contained an invoice for the remaining balance owed for his work, a modest sum that represented the tail end of his agreed payment. The man behind the desk looked up from his papers, saw the envelope, saw the old bricklayer standing there quietly, and something inside him snapped. The accumulated stress of the day, the pressure from investors, the fear of failure, all of it focused suddenly on this quiet old man who worked too slowly and now had the audacity to interrupt with paperwork about money. The words that came out were harsh, loud enough that workers outside stopped their cleanup to listen. The accusation was clear and cutting, something about begging, about earning money rather than asking for it, about working faster if he wanted to be paid faster. The old bricklayer stood still, his weathered face showing no anger, no defense, no argument. He simply listened until the words ran out, until the office fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic beyond the site fence. Workers gathered near the door, frozen in place, watching. Some looked at the ground, uncomfortable. Others stared at the man behind the desk with barely concealed disappointment. But nobody spoke. Nobody challenged the moment. The hierarchy of the site, the invisible rules of employment and authority, kept them silent. The bricklayer reached forward slowly and picked up his envelope. He folded it carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket. Then he turned and walked out of the office without a word. The workers parted to let him pass, their eyes following him as he made his way to where his tools were stored. He packed methodically, the same careful precision he brought to his brickwork. Trowels cleaned and wrapped, level checked and secured, everything in its proper place. Before he left the site, he paused near the eastern wing, looking at the wall he had built. His hand reached out and touched the surface, fingers tracing the lines of mortar between bricks. He stood there for a long moment, as if saying goodbye to something, or perhaps acknowledging something others couldn't see. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear enough for the nearby workers to hear. The words were simple, almost philosophical, about bricks having history, about making sure you know your own. It wasn't a threat or a curse. It was just an observation, delivered with the gentleness of someone who had learned painful truths over a long lifetime. He picked up his toolbox and walked toward the exit, his shadow stretching long across the concrete. Workers watched him go, their faces troubled. Some wanted to say something, to stop him, to challenge what had happened. But they didn't. They returned to their cleanup, moving quietly, the usual end-of-day banter replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The man in the suit emerged from the office, saw the workers' expressions, and felt a flicker of something he quickly suppressed. He had a building to complete. There was no time for sentiment. Days passed, and the construction continued. New workers were brought in to fill gaps in the schedule. The eastern wing wall progressed faster now, multiple workers laying bricks at standard speed. The careful, slow precision was replaced by efficient productivity. The man in the suit was satisfied. Numbers were improving. Timelines were being met. Then came the inspection. It arrived without drama, a routine requirement for any building of this size. A government-certified team showed up with clipboards, measuring equipment, and serious expressions. The man in the suit greeted them confidently, walking them through the site, pointing out the quality of materials, the strength of the foundation, the precision of the structural work. He had invested in the best, cut no corners on safety or stability. The building was solid. The inspectors moved through the structure methodically, checking documents, comparing measurements, examining welds and joints. Everything seemed in order. Then one of them pulled out a thermal scanning device, a rectangular instrument with a small screen that showed temperature variations within solid materials. It was standard equipment for detecting hidden defects, moisture problems, or structural irregularities inside walls. They began scanning the load-bearing walls, starting with the foundation sections. The man in the suit stood nearby, watching the screen display its abstract patterns of color, warm reds and cool blues indicating density and composition. Most of it looked exactly as expected, uniform blocks of color showing consistent material throughout. But then the inspector paused, moving the scanner back over a section, leaning closer to the screen with a puzzled expression. There were patterns inside the bricks, faint but deliberate, not cracks or defects, something else. The inspector called over the team lid, and they examined the image together, moving the scanner across a wider area. The patterns appeared in multiple locations, concentrated especially in the foundation and lower walls. They were marks of some kind, intentional indentations pressed into the interfaces of bricks before they were set in place. The man in the suit felt confusion rather than concern. The building was structurally sound, that was clear. But what were these marks? The chief inspector, a man with 30 years of experience written in the lines of his face, looked at the images and smiled slightly, a recognition in his eyes. He began explaining, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing professional history rather than citing code violations. Old-school bricklayers, he said, practiced a tradition that went back centuries. They would carve small marks into the hidden faces of bricks, the surfaces that would be pressed into mortar and never seen again. These weren't graffiti or vandalism. They were signatures, marks of accountability and craft pride, A master bricklayer would often carve the initials of workers who had earned respect, embedding their names literally into the structure. It was a way of honoring people, of creating invisible records, of saying that this building was made by human hands that cared about the work. The practice had largely died out with industrialization and modern construction methods, but a few old craftsmen still maintained the tradition. The inspector had seen it only a handful of times in his career, always in the work of elderly bricklayers who had learned the trade in a different era. It was considered a mark of exceptional integrity. The man in the suit listened, processing this information. He asked to see the thermal images more clearly. The inspector showed him, pointing out the various marks scattered throughout the foundation walls. Most were small, simple patterns. But then the inspector highlighted one section, the main foundation support that bore the weight of the entire eastern wing. The marks here were deeper, more elaborate, carved with particular care. And when the inspector enhanced the image, adjusting for contrast and clarity, the pattern became unmistakable. They were initials, his initials. The man in the suit stared at the screen, at these letters hidden deep inside the foundation of his building, placed where no one would ever see them, carved into the permanent structure of his achievement. The inspector explained what this meant. The bricklayer had been honoring him, marking the building as something created under honest leadership, passing on a tradition that said this structure and its owner were worthy of remembrance. The understanding hit him like a physical weight. He stood silently, staring at the thermal image, while the inspectors continued their work around him. His mind replayed moments he had dismissed or forgotten. The way the old man touched each brick before placing it. The careful precision that he had mistaken for slowness. The respect the other workers showed, a respect he had attributed to simple courtesy rather than genuine admiration. The quiet dignity with which the bricklayer had accepted humiliation and left without argument. The inspectors finished their assessment and confirmed what he already knew. The building was structurally sound, built to exceptional standards. They particularly praised the foundation work, noting the superior quality of the brickwork in the eastern sections. They gathered their equipment, filed their reports, and left with professional handshakes and routine congratulations. The man stood alone inside the unfinished building after they departed. The workers had gone home for the evening. The machinery was silent. Only the distant sound of traffic and the occasional creak of settling materials disturbed the quiet. He walked to the eastern wing and placed his hand against the wall, the same wall he had watched being built brick by slow brick. Under his palm, invisible beneath layers of mortar and clay, were his initials, carved by hands that shook with age or injury, placed there by someone who had believed he was worthy of honor. He sat down on a stack of lumber, his expensive suit collecting dust, and put his head in his hands. The building suddenly looked different, not as a monument to his success or a testament to his business acumen, but as something created by human effort, by countless hands and decisions, by people whose names he barely knew and whose sacrifices he had never considered. He had seen only numbers and schedules. He had missed the humanity entirely. The regret came slowly at first, then overwhelmed him. Not the surface regret of a bad business decision or a public relations mistake. Something deeper. The recognition that he had treated with contempt someone who had offered respect. That he had responded to craftsmanship with impatience. That he had humiliated someone who had been quietly honoring him. The weight of it settled into his chest and made it hard to breathe. He needed to find the bricklayer. Not to apologize in the abstract, not to settle the debt and move on, but to understand, to make it right in whatever way he could. He pulled out his phone and began making calls. The site supervisor gave him a name, but no contact information. The workers he reached had only vague knowledge of where the old man lived, somewhere in the older neighborhoods south of downtown. He spent the next several days following thin lids, asking at building supply shops, talking to other contractors, searching through the scattered networks of the construction trade. Finally, someone remembered seeing the old bricklayer working on a small property in a neighborhood of modest homes and aging buildings. The man drove there during his lunch break, winding through the narrow streets lined with chain-link fences and cars parked on brown lawns. He found the address and parked across the street, watching. The house was small and damaged. Part of the roof collapsed, one wall leaning at an angle that defied gravity. In the yard, surrounded by piles of reclaimed bricks and salvaged lumber, the bricklayer worked. But his movements were different here, more labored, struggling. The man watched him lift a brick and saw his hands shake violently, saw him nearly drop it, saw him pause and steady himself before attempting to place it. The careful precision was still there, but now it was fighting against a body that wouldn't cooperate. The man got out of his car and walked across the street. The bricklayer noticed him approaching and straightened slowly, recognition flickering across his weathered face, but no hostility, just patient acknowledgement. They stood several feet apart, neither speaking immediately, the air between them heavy with everything unsaid. The man found his voice finally and asked if they could talk. The bricklayer nodded and gestured toward a makeshift bench made from a plank across two cinder blocks. They sat, the old wood creaking under their weight, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant bark of a dog and the rustle of wind through nearby trees. The man started to speak, to explain about the inspection and the discovery, but the bricklayer raised a trembling hand gently, stopping him. Then, slowly, in a quiet voice roughened by years and dust, the old man began to tell his story. He had a son once, a good boy, strong and eager, who followed his father into the construction trade. The boy was talented, learned quickly, had the makings of a master craftsman. He died on a construction site 20 years ago, killed when an improperly secured load shifted and fell. He was 23 years old. And his boss refused to pay him for his final 2 weeks of work, said the boy's carelessness had cost the company money, that he had forfeited his wages. The old bricklayer's voice remained steady as he told this, but his hands shook harder, and the man realized the trembling wasn't entirely physical. It was the echo of grief that never fully healed, loss that had settled into his bones and affected everything he touched. After his son's death, the bricklayer had continued working, needing the income, needing the routine, needing something to hold on to. But he had changed his practice. He began carving names and initials into the hidden faces of bricks, honoring workers, marking buildings with the invisible record of who had built them. But more than that, he had started marking the names of employers he believed were fair. Bosses who treated workers with dignity, who paid them honestly, who valued their humanity. It was his way of saying these people deserved to be remembered, that their leadership was as much a part of the building as the physical materials. He had carved the man's initials into the foundation because he had believed at first that he was that kind of person, someone worth honoring. The words settled between them like stones. The man felt his throat tighten, felt shame burning in his chest. He tried to apologize, the words coming out clumsy and inadequate. He pulled out his checkbook, offering to pay not just the outstanding invoice, but more, whatever was needed. The bricklayer shook his head slowly, his expression not angry, but sad, disappointed in a way that cut deeper than any accusation. Money wasn't the point, he explained gently. He had survived worse than unpaid invoices. What hurt was the loss of dignity, the public humiliation, the casual cruelty of having his work and his person dismissed so easily. You couldn't restore dignity with a check. Respect wasn't a transaction. The man sat in silence, understanding but not knowing how to respond. Everything he had built his life around, success and wealth and achievement, suddenly seemed hollow. He had accumulated so much and understood so little. He looked at the damaged house, at the old bricklayers shaking hands, at the piles of salvaged materials representing months of slow, painful work, and realized how profoundly he had misjudged what mattered. He asked quietly what he could do. The bricklayer shrugged, a gesture of resignation rather than dismissal. There was nothing to do. Life continued. Buildings got built. People did their work and went home. Some things couldn't be fixed, only accepted. But the man couldn't accept that. He stood, looked at the damaged house again, and made a decision that surprised even himself. He asked for permission to help, not with money, but with work. The bricklayer studied him for a long moment, searching his face for sincerity, then nodded slowly. The next morning, the man returned, but not alone. He brought his entire construction crew, trucks loaded with materials, tools, equipment. The workers arrived confused, having been told only that they had a special project for the day, but when they saw the old bricklayer standing in the yard, recognition spread through the group. Some of them smiled, others nodded with understanding. They unloaded materials and set to work without needing instruction. The project took shape quickly with so many skilled hands. The collapsed roof was reinforced and repaired. The leaning wall was shored up and straightened. New bricks were laid where old ones had crumbled. The workers moved with purpose but without the usual rush, taking time to do things properly, checking their work carefully. They were building not for profit or deadline, but for something else, something they couldn't quite name but recognized instinctively. The man worked alongside them, inexperienced but willing. He carried materials, mixed mortar, followed instructions. He learned how to hold a trowel properly, how to place a brick so it aligned with its neighbors, how to check a level and trust the bubble. His hands grew sore and his back ached, and he was grateful for both. The bricklayer tried to help, his pride not allowing him to simply watch others work on his home. But his hands betrayed him, shaking so badly he couldn't hold tools steady. He stood beside the wall, attempting to place a brick, and it nearly slipped from his grip. The man moved to his side, not taking the brick away, but placing his own hands over the bricklayer's trembling ones, steadying them, supporting them. Together they placed the brick, and together they tapped it into position. The man spoke quietly, words about foundations and debt, about laying this one for him, because he had laid so many for others. The work continued through the day and into the next week. Workers came before and after their regular shifts, volunteering their time, bringing materials from their own supplies. The damaged house slowly transformed, becoming solid again, weatherproof again, safe again. The bricklayer watched with eyes that glistened, overwhelmed by the generosity, by the demonstration that he mattered, that his life and work had value beyond any paycheck. Months passed. The luxury building was completed, and preparations began for its grand opening. It was an impressive structure, glass and steel rising above the city, a new landmark promising upscale apartments and modern amenities. Investors were pleased. Media coverage was extensive. The opening ceremony was scheduled with all the usual pageantry, ribbon cutting, speeches, champagne, press photos. The man, polished and professional in his tailored suit, stood before the assembled crowd. City officials, business partners, real estate agents, journalists, all gathered to celebrate this achievement. The building rose behind him, gleaming in the sunlight, a monument to successful development and architectural ambition. Cameras captured every angle. Reporters prepared their questions. The ceremony began with the customary speeches, acknowledgments, thanks to various parties. Then came the moment for the ceremonial first brick of the building's commemorative marker, a symbolic cornerstone to be placed during the celebration. Everyone expected the man to perform this honor himself, to place the brick and cement, his personal association with the project. Instead, he gestured to someone at the edge of the crowd. The old bricklayer stepped forward, moving slowly, his trembling visible even from a distance. He wore his work clothes, clean but worn, carrying the stains of a lifetime of construction sites. He looked out of place among the suits and expensive dresses, but he walked forward with quiet dignity, his weathered face showing both surprise and understanding. The crowd quieted, confused by this deviation from the script. The man explained simply, his voice carrying through the microphone, that this building stood because of the foundation laid by this craftsman, that true achievement was always built on the work of many hands, that honor belonged to those who did the work rather than those who signed the checks. He stepped aside and gestured for the bricklayer to place the ceremonial brick. A trowel was offered, mortar was ready. But when the old man reached for the brick, his hands shook too badly to lift it. He tried twice, his jaw tight with determination and frustration. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence, unsure how to respond to this unexpected struggle. The man stepped forward again, not to take over, but to help. He placed his hands beneath the bricklayers, supporting the brick's weight, steadying the trembling. Together they lifted it. Together they guided it into position. Together they smoothed the mortar and set it level. When it was placed, when the brick was finally settled into its permanent position, the crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite recognition of ceremony, but genuine appreciation. People responding to something authentic and human, breaking through the usual corporate polish. The workers from the original construction crew, standing at the back of the crowd, cheered loudest. Some wiped at their eyes, not bothering to hide the emotion. They had built this structure, and now they saw their work honored properly, represented by the old man whose careful precision had taught them what true craftsmanship meant. But the man wasn't finished. He raised his hand for silence, and the crowd settled again. He made one more announcement, unexpected and unrehearsed. The building would carry a second name, not replacing the official corporate designation, but supplementing it. An engraved plaque near the entrance would bear the name of a young construction worker who had died too young, whose life had meant something, whose memory deserved preservation in stone and metal. The bricklayer's son would be remembered here, his name carved not into hidden brick faces, but displayed proudly for everyone to see. The old bricklayer stood very still, his face working through emotions too complex for simple tears. The man placed a hand on his shoulder, supporting him as they stood together before the crowd. The cameras captured it all. The unlikely pairing, the visible emotion, the moment of genuine human connection breaking through the usual barriers of class and profession. The ceremony continued, but its tone had changed. The speeches that followed were more heartfelt, more grounded. People seemed more aware of the workers standing nearby, the people whose labor had transformed architectural drawings into physical reality. Conversations at the reception afterward focused less on property values and investment returns and more on the building itself, the craft that went into it, the human stories embedded in its structure. As the event wound down and the crowd dispersed, the man and the bricklayer stood together near the commemorative brick, looking at the building rising above them. The old man touched the brick they had placed together, his fingers tracing its rough surface. He spoke quietly, his voice almost lost in the city sounds around them, saying something about how bricks themselves had no memory, how they were just clay and fire, just material. But people remembered. People carried forward the stories, the names, the meaning. The man nodded, understanding finally what he had missed before. Buildings weren't monuments to wealth or success. They were records of human effort, containers of stories, physical evidence that people had been here, had worked here, had cared enough to do things properly. His initials carved into hidden bricks weren't about honoring him. They were about holding him accountable, about saying that this building would stand as testimony to how he had treated people, to whether he had been worthy of their respect. They stood together as the sun set behind the building, casting long shadows across the plaza. The old bricklayer's hands still trembled, but they held steady enough to touch the brick one more time, leaving a faint print in the still damp mortar. The man placed his own hand beside it, pressing firmly, leaving his mark alongside the craftsman's. Two prints, side by side, preserved in the foundation of something larger than either of them alone. The cameras had packed up. The crowd had gone. The ceremony was over. But the building remained solid and permanent, carrying within its walls and foundation the invisible history of everyone who had helped create it. Names carved in hidden places. Initials pressed into mortar, stories embedded in the structure itself, and at its entrance, a plaque bearing a name that would have been forgotten, now remembered in metal and stone. The man understood now what the bricklayer had meant that day when he left the construction site. Every brick had a history, and now he knew his own. Before you go, let me ask you something. If you were the one standing in that man's shoes, after all the pressure, all the stress, all the mistakes, what would you have done differently? Would you have walked away? Would you have apologized sooner? Or do you think the old man was the one who showed more strength in the end? Tell me honestly in the comments, who was the real hero of this story? The boss who changed, or the bricklayer who never lost his dignity? And one more thing. Where are you watching this story from? I always love seeing where my family around the world is tuning in.